Okay, well, we'll get started while everyone else sort of straggles in. First off, I wanted to mention this came up in the critical thinking responses in the 340 class, so I thought I'd go over it now. So we'll see tourism in more detail later in this class, but people were already bringing it up in their arguments, so I want to sort of define this. When you look at tourism, in the sense of course, the huge discussion going on right now, are you going to restart tourism, etc.? It's important to remember that tourism is the most recent of the world's economic systems. Tourism didn't exist in a modern sense until the mid-19th century. And tourism, in the sense that we think of it today, didn't exist until basically the post-World War II, 1950s, 1960s. So tourism as a modern industry is really, really recent. It goes maybe, just figure sort of arbitrarily 70 years. So tourism, one, is quite new. And even back by, I'd say, the 1980s, maybe even to the 1990s, people saw tourism as an auxiliary enterprise. So for most economies in most places, this would include Mexico, in fact, even in Hawaii, right into the 1980s, people saw tourism as one of the ways you could make money at a place. But it wasn't seen as a major way of making money, just one of them. So when you're looking at tourism, it's important to remember that it's incredibly recent. And this becomes really important because what that means is basically, for example, economists really haven't studied it very much. There really hasn't been a lot of long-term study of the impacts of tourism because tourism hasn't been around long enough to have long-term studies. And academics and such really haven't looked at tourism in many ways until maybe 15 years ago. Having said that, tourism is now, outside of military spending, tourism is the second largest economic item on the planet. It's estimated that a third of the world's countries depend on tourism as their main revenue stream. There's a whole mess of areas. Hawaii is a good case in point. Florida is another one, where basically tourism is what runs your economy, and without it, everything just comes to a halt. We can see that here. The numbers that are starting to show up here, which are even worse than people thought, is basically that tourism, directly or indirectly, is almost 80% of our budget here. Without it, the only other major economic item in Hawaii other than tourism is military spending. So somewhere in the last 40, 50 years, in Hawaii, as in many places, tourism went from being something to being the only thing. Guam's another good case in point. Guam has exactly the same situation as Hawaii. And so this becomes, tourism becomes absolutely critical when you realize that, one, it's very, very recent. Two, it's now the major economic system for a number of the world's economies. You might have heard that both Italy and Greece right now are looking at bankruptcy because their tourism market's completely gone and they have no economy without tourism. So you're talking about whole countries literally going bankrupt because they have no revenue coming in. So tourism is a enormous economic engine, and yet there's very little understanding of exactly what tourism actually consists of. And there's sort of three things I just want to mention quickly. We'll get into, like I said, later in the semester. One is tourism is entirely based on what we call discretionary income. Now, what this means is when Selena pays all her bills, when she pays her rent and she, her whatever, car insurance, whatever else she has to pay, food or whatever she has to have just to survive on. She doesn't have any money left because she's a student, but if she was actually a normal working person rather than a shamanat student, whatever money she had left after that would be called what we call discretionary money. Now that's money that she has the choice of figuring out what she wants to do with it. Now, right now in the whole COVID world, people are really paranoid, so people are sitting on money. If COVID suddenly disappears from the planet tomorrow, then what you're going to see is people are going to start looking around saying, well, I guess I don't need to save this money for a bad day. I can spend it. And if you're classically local, that means we go to Vegas. Now, if you're going to Vegas, that means you're not going to Costco to buy a big screen TV. You're not going to get new wheels for the car. You're not doing anything. All discretionary money is one pool of money. What you choose to spend it on is your choice. So that's what we mean by discretionary. It's choice. If people are freaked out, they won't spend it at all. That's one of the issues they've got now with COVID. But even if you have it, one of the other key factors of that then is discretionary money means that it's one pocket of money, which means if you spend it on this item, you can't spend it on that item. So if your Boyd group, which is the big, Vegas folks recruiting here, Vacations Hawaii. They're trying to convince you folks that going to Vegas and staying at their casino is a better use of your spare money than any other option. And of course, any other location that wants you to go there is going to try to get you to do the same thing. And also, any other thing that wants you to buy the thing is going to try to convince you that's a better use of money than the vacation. So tourism is in direct competition with anything else you could spend funny money on. And every tourist destination is in competition with every other tourist destination. So when you're looking at tourism, this is the first and most important part. Tourism is always based on discretionary income. And they're always competing with every place else. The other key factor is what that means is if I'm a tourist going somewhere and I've spent the money on that, I have a very strong sense that that destination has to fulfill my stereotypes of why I chose that place. I'm not interested in what the place says about itself. I'm not interested in what that place wants from me. As far as I'm concerned, I spent the money and they owe me now. It's like buying a product. I expect this for the money I spent. This is one reason why geographers like me point out that if you try to have the bubble tourism that they're talking about starting up, it won't work. Because for a large part of the population that comes over here as tourists, they don't care what our concerns are about them. As far as they're concerned, if they paid, $1,500 to stay for a week in Hawaii, they get to do what they want to with it. And one of the main things you do in Hawaii, of course, is go and interact with the environment. And you can't do that in the hotels. So the reality is going to be a large number of those people with those wristbands or whatever are going to break them. They're just going to go out and figure they're going to dare you basically to do something about them because I'm tourist, I paid my money and I get to see this stuff because that's what tourists do. Now, if we go somewhere else, we're going to do the same thing. So when you look at tourism, tourism is always based on the basic principle the customer is always right. Now we see this when you get folks to say, well, you should educate tourists in environmental issues in Hawaii, and social issues in Hawaii and stuff like that. And then these people get upset because it doesn't seem like it has any impact. Well, when you think about it, why would it? If you're trying to educate people, but they're here to have a good time, party, drink Mai Tais, and go on the beach and do whatever it is they want to do, they're totally disinterested in what your concerns about, even if you're from there, because they're not interested in you. They're interested in enjoying what they've spent the money on. So when you talk about tourism, you're talking about stereotypes. People buy stereotypes when they buy tourism. And so in buying in that stereotype, they expect satisfaction for the money spent. For now, that's all we need to get into with all this. But that's the thing you got to remember with tourism. Tourism is a very unique thing. It's been around for a very short period of time. If you, for example, get real aggro at lecturing people and not letting them do this, that, and the other thing, then they'll just go somewhere else because there's nothing that says you have to come to X. There's always another option. If Hawaii gives you too much attitude, you go to Cozumel. If they give you too much attitude, you go to Disney World or Disneyland or Disney World or whatever it is in Florida. There's always something else you can do. There's always someplace else to play. There's always something else to spend your time and have a good time at. And if the place you wanted to go to won't let you have a good time, then you're just going to say, screw you, and you're going to find some other thing. So tourism is a situation where the tourist destination has no control over tourism. Or more accurately, it has no control over tourists. The tourists are in control. In the same way that Walmart can't tell the shoppers that go into a Walmart store what you're going to buy and how you're going to act. The Walmart is there to satisfy the needs of their customers. And the tourism destination like Hawaii is in exactly the same shape. You might want them to do something, but you can't make them do anything. And this is always something that's really hard for people to remember. You get Sierra Club and other groups like that, they're all like, you got to educate the tourist and be more environmentally responsible. Dude, that ain't going to happen. Tourism is not an environmentally responsible industry. It's an enjoyment industry. So just sort of keep that in mind when we get into this whole issue of tourism, and especially when we get into like people start talking about like tourism impacts. Remember what type of an engine it is. And so the location is not in control of tourism. Okay, so let's segue into what I wanted to actually go into today. That was the other class brought this up already, so covered. So we look at this is on the Big Island. So we're on the Big Island. This is the Kona or the dry side of the Big Island. And if you notice here, what you actually see, if you remember I was mentioning before this issue of mist coming down and the change in vegetation, you can actually see the mist line right here. Notice how much drier it is here than it is over here. That's not irrigation. That's literally, this is now, in this day and age, this is where the mist coming down the sides of Mauna Kea comes to a halt. And so this area gets a lot less mist than this is. They get the same amount of rain, but the mist stops right about where this belt road is here. Now, if you notice, there's a lot of lines here. This is the other form of a dryland field system. So I'm going to go into this just a little bit because I can't explain the environmental changes in the monarchy unless I go through this. So if you remember, I mentioned before, dryland field systems would be clumps of trees, planting under the trees and taking advantage of this mist area. Somewhere in the 1600s, as far as we can tell, 1600s, on the Big Island, this literally a new invention takes place. And this system that you see here is unique to Hawaii. It was invented by Hawaiians. It's only found in Hawaii. And it was never found anywhere else. And sad to say, it pretty much, as we'll see, collapses by the 1820s. So if you notice, you got all these little sort of lines here. We zoom in, we can see these are actually little rock walls. Now, if you notice, they're real crappy walls. And this is one of the key aspects of this system. This system is essentially like a massively exaggerated version of the type of stuff you see traditionally in drylands. So in the same way the Hawaiian fish pond's sort of a modified, fancy version of a lagoon, this is in the same way as taking an existing system, and the Hawaiians reinvented a massive way to sort of amplify it. I've done a really bad drawing here and sort of have to use this now. So if you exaggerate this, let me swing back here. If you look at this, we're going downhill. So these lines, these rows of rocks are at right angles to the slope. So the hill's going down this way, and these lines are like this. So this is one cut in cross section. I've exaggerated the slope here. So here's one of these rock walls. They're just piles of rocks. They're not stacked up into anything. It's just literally someone walking down, picking up rocks and throwing them into a line. So what you're going to get is these piles of rocks going across the landscape. Now, what some very clever group of people, or very clever individual did, is they came to the realization that if you actually have a slope like this, you put these piles of rocks here, what will happen is when it actually does rain, is the rain will wash the soil, the loose soil down, and the soil will basically pile up on the mauka or upslope side of the rocks. What you also do then is you throw compost, just old rotted leaves and whatever, in this stack of rocks, this long pile of rocks. And what you do is you then plant banana, you plant sugar cane, you plant tea as one of the really big ones, because all those can handle a fair amount of low water. And so what you do is you plant those in there now, especially the tea gets up to about 15 feet high in this area. So what you're doing is you're actually providing a form of almost like tree cover. Now, if you sit there and you do rows and rows and rows of these things, you'll actually cool the soil down and you'll slow the wind down. And what you'll actually do is increase the amount of mist that you get. So if you do these, what you actually end up with is a mist-based system of agriculture. You take that soil that's piled up on the mauka side of, for example, this row right here. If you looked right here, you'd find that on the backside here, there's actually a small sort of slope of loose dirt. And so that's what you plant your crops in. So you plant sweet potato, maybe some yams. Every single one of these rows would have taller vegetation growing in it. And then it would have basically food crops growing just on this side of each line. Now, when you do that, you end up with almost an automatic feeding system. You end up with an enormous amount of food. To put it in a context, if I zoom out, notice how these lines come on. Now, this particular field, this is part of the Kona field system. It goes all the way from here, all the way down to here. The Kona system goes all the way from here, all the way to here. The Kona system goes all the way from here, all the way down. So what you've got are these massive field systems. Everything you see here that's in brown all the way up to light green was an agricultural field system providing food. This was the largest single agricultural system in the Hawaiian Islands. And what it meant is it revolutionized this island, the Big Island, because it suddenly meant that you could have a large number of people in which was otherwise a very dry place that actually had limited vegetation, limited food, and limited options for people. So if you were to look at, if we had a satellite image from 1760, you'd see that all this area would be green all the way down to around here. And there'd be large numbers of people all the way down to here living in systems like this. And we did work, I don't know, about 15 years ago over here. And there's another south field system, goes all the way down to, almost down to Arch Rock down here. It goes down below Kaluahe. So you've got field systems on this whole side of the island, which meant that all of a sudden, which had been the sort of low population side, all of a sudden now is your massive population base. This is why the Big Island chiefs were able to take war to the other islands, and this is why Kamehameha was able to conquer the other islands. In part was due to the fact that he had this enormous population base and this enormous amount of food resources. So the field systems are absolutely critical. They're responsible for the success of the Big Island chiefs. And to a certain extent, they say they make the monarchy possible because they provide a huge food surplus. Now, if you notice, when you look at that, then comes the question, well, what happened? And for this, we have to segue back. Okay. And I mentioned this before, but I just want to reiterate because it comes back in. Two things are really key here. One is you have to remember that all the chiefs that are alive are competitive with all the other chiefs. If you're a high chief, you're only in that situation because you're the best of the bunch. And every other high chief around you is going to try to conquer you. This happened all the time in the 1700s. Kahekili, the high chief on Maui, twice takes over Oahu, puts his own chief in, then the guy, his subsidiary on Oahu, basically then revolts, declares himself the high chief of Oahu, and the Maui chief come back and beat him again. The Big Island chiefs are always beating up on each other, and then they go over beat on the Maui chiefs, et cetera, et cetera. So if you were in charge, you're only in charge as long as you could keep it. So it's sort of like kids playing on a sandhill. So all the chiefs were competitive players. And of course, if you lose, you end up dead in someone else's house. So it was really motivated competition. This was not for the passive or the meek. And as I mentioned before, it's very Game of Thrones in that regard. The second is, in the Hawaiian system, I might have mentioned this before, knowledge is mana. So mana is held in what you know. It's not only what you say or what you make, but it's actually in what you know. So knowledge was a form of mana. And the chiefs were very, very aware of this because, of course, they got their authority through the idea of mana. So when the Europeans show up, when Cook and them show up in 1778 and the other guys show up a few years later, the chiefs start to jump on them because they see them, they're very aware of the fact that these Europeans have new knowledge that they're not aware of. And so if you're a chief, what you're going to do is you're going to monopolize that European knowledge. You're not going to share it. You're not going to teach people. You want to hold that to you because that gives you mana. If you give it out and let other people learn it, then you're actually giving away your mana. So in that situation, high chiefs would grab Europeans. And in fact, many of the high chiefs, Kamehameha especially, actually kidnap European sailors and force them to become part of their entourage because they want to monopolize that mana. And then they realize the easiest way to do it is actually grab the guy that has it and plop him down in front of you and say, guess what, you got a choice. You either work for me or you die. And so what happens is the chiefs aren't so much in awe of the European knowledge, and they don't see the European knowledge necessarily as being better, but they do see it as being different and unique, and therefore you want to monopolize access to it. And Kamehameha by far is the best at this. Now what this means also is you're going to sit down and talk to these Europeans because having the guy that has the knowledge isn't as good as actually holding the knowledge in yourself. So if you're very good at this, Kamehameha was, he was by far the best. What you do is you actually talk to these Europeans, specifically guys like Vancouver, and you learn as much as you can from them. Now, you're not listening to what they're saying and actually thinking they're right, but you want to know what it is they think they know because you're going to add that to what you know, and that gives you more mana. And it also means if you learn it and no one else has, you're the only one in the Hawaiian Islands that has that mana. So therefore, that gives you one up on all your competition. So you have to remember this is all based on the need to be competitively successful against your, other folks. And Kamehameha does this the best. Let's switch back here. And so in that situation, what you have is one of the things that he comes to the conclusion when he's hearing the Europeans, and most specifically guys like Vancouver. And again, you have to remember that the Europeans like Vancouver spoke Tahitian. They weren't fluent necessarily in Tahitian, though Cook was, and Cleric and King, Cleric and King, the two captains of the ships in Cook's third expedition, were both fluent in Tahitian because they'd spent weeks, in one case months, in Tahiti. So when they come up to Hawaii, they can talk to the Hawaiians. If you know Tahitian, you can be understood in Hawaiian. If you know Hawaiian, you can understand what Tahitians are saying. It's like a really different accent, but it's not a different language per se. So when the British come up here, and later the French after them, they can actually communicate with the Hawaiians. It's not a grunt and point and guess what the hell they're saying type thing. They can't communicate in a real sophisticated way, but they can talk and understand each other. And so in that situation, folks like Kamehameha immediately take advantage of this ability to communicate and try to acquire as much of this as they can. Now, at the time the Europeans show up, initially he's one of the sons of his dad, Kalaniʻaupuu, who's the big chief on the Big Island. But when the British show up the second time, the Vancouver expedition, Vancouver had been a lieutenant on the Cook expedition. He and Kamehameha were both young, in their teens, early 20s then, and had became friends and spent a lot of time talking to each other in the time that the expedition was here. Cook dies on the island. The expedition leaves to go back to England. About 8 years later, Vancouver, now who's been promoted, now leads another expedition back to Hawaii. When he lands on the Big Island, he's sort of surprised but happy to realize that his buddy, Kamehameha, is now the high chief for that part of the Big Island. So they immediately restart their friendship and again have these long conversations with each other, in which Kamehameha is basically milking him of knowledge so that he can figure out what it is he wants to do. And he very quickly had come to the realization that the Europeans had different ways of doing things, that if he modified them and shifted them, he could put himself in a situation not just of being one of the chiefs, but become the dominant chief of the islands. So he sees the Europeans as something he can play and use. Now, Vancouver was okay with this because he thought, Kamehameha was he was a pretty decent guy as far as he was concerned. He understood how he worked. Kamehameha promised to sort of obey and pay attention and help the British out, which he did for the rest of his life. So to Vancouver, this is a good trade. So the two of them get these intimate conversations where they're discussing everything from politics to how European economies work, all sorts of stuff like this. From this, Kamehameha builds his idea for how he's going to turn the islands into what would be called a monarchy. He doesn't get taught that. He figures out and builds his own model for that. And that's what becomes the Hawaiian monarchy, is its Kamehameha-defined, Kamehameha-built system. Now, one of the things that Vancouver points out to them that he's going to have to do if he wants this to work is he's got to find ways to have products that the European ships that are landing in Hawaii will be willing to trade what he wants, which is largely guns, cannon, ammunition, and stuff like that. If he wants those things, he's got to have something to give the Europeans to get that stuff. And Vancouver points out that given the fact that Hawaiian technology was pretty limited in terms of what Europeans were after, is the most obvious thing is to basically raise meat animals, which they didn't have except for pigs. And with those meat animals, you trade for the Europeans, you trade them food for guns. And so what he does, he gives Kamehameha some of his cattle, the sheep and the goats, and shows him and some of the guys how to basically raise them successfully for the purpose of then taking these animals when they reproduce, taking the beef, for example, butchering the animal, taking the meat, putting it into wooden cask, and then you salt it, and now you've got this preserved meat, and that's what the European ships survived on. So he points out to them, if you can provide this food, you can get the guns and other stuff that you seem to think you need to become the leader of the Hawaiian Islands. And this becomes the most important sort of environmental consequence of this early period of interreaction. Because when you see this, this is the result. Kamehameha does exactly what Vancouver thought he should do. He sits there and he basically lets the herd animals loose. And what he does is he lets the herd animals loose and he sets up a series of kapu. And so the kapu he set up are very explicit. And basically the kapus are, you cannot touch these animals. You cannot harass these animals. You have to let these animals run around and eat whatever it is they want because the chiefs need the meat off the animals. Now, you have to remember in Hawaii, this is your field system on the Big Island. And if you notice, this field system has no walls. The only walls are going this way. There's nothing to keep animals out because these walls are only about 1 meter high. And they're just loose piled stones. So if you're a goat, goats can climb fences up to 6, 7 feet tall. Even cattle can jump over a 4 foot or climb over a 4 or 5 foot wall. So what you've got is all of a sudden these grazing animals show up. And the first thing they do is they eat all the food in the Dryland field system. because to them, the yams and the sweet potatoes, that's fantastic. That's better than eating grass. And you have to remember, at this period, you didn't have pasture grass. You had peely grass, which cattle don't like. So the animals reproduce and basically feed themselves off of the food of the population. So in doing that, you do two things. One is you destroy the field systems, because the animals not only eat the crops, they also eat the high vegetation that you've got planted on the walls that's going to capture the mist. So within a very, very short period of time, what had been a green, very productive field system very quickly starts to shrink, because when you start to eat the higher vegetation, the heat temperature index of the soil increases, the heat rises, and that pushes the mist, and pretty soon the mist goes from here to here to here to here. But sad to say, most of the population doesn't really give a crap, because at that point the animals already eaten all their food. And they can't do anything about it, because the high chief, Kamehameha, has declared that you can't touch the animals, you can't throw rocks at the animals, you can't chase them out. If they're eating your food, you just have to let them eat your food and you starve. The choice between you starving and the animals being fed is not a choice. Kamehameha needs the animals because he needs their meat. He does not need you as much as he needs the animals. So the main consequences by the early 19th century, this looks like it does now. Now it's getting the same amount of rainfall it did 100 years earlier. But because you've now destroyed the field system, you now change the entire environmental system in this whole part of the island, and now it's gotten a lot hotter, it's a lot drier, and the vegetation is entirely collapsed. And now this whole area looks, it's a near desert situation in an area that prior to that was one of your most impressive agricultural systems. Now this has nothing to do with something that always drives us crazy in this business. This has nothing to do with missionaries. Missionaries won't even be here for another 20 years. This is entirely done by the high chiefs for the purpose of acquiring technology that they need to beat the competition, which are other chiefs. And Kamehameha, it works. He ends up with more guns, with more cannon, and wipes out the Maui guys, and then a couple of years later goes and wipes out the Oahu guys, and then becomes the quote king of the islands, and the monarchy starts up. But the monarchy starts up because of the fact that you've completely destroyed this ecosystem on the Big Island. Now, ironically, when people talk about sustainability, you can't do it on the rest of the islands because the areas that where agriculture are now largely residential, especially here on Oahu. Ironically, the only system you can actually bring back if you wanted to, if there's enough will to do it, there's absolutely no reason that you couldn't reconstitute large parts of the field system, because right now this is still largely ranch land, it's just pasturage. So if you decided to, sort of throw the ranching industry out of this part of the Big Island, you could eventually rebuild this dryland agricultural system, but it would require a large amount, in fact, an enormous investment in terms of physical human labor to make it happen. Would you get a lot of food out of it? Yeah. Is it realistic in the 21st century? No, it's not going to happen. So of all the environmental agricultural systems in the Hawaiian Islands, this is probably the most doable with the least consequences. Because unlike things like fish ponds, you don't require ancillary things like streams flowing and springs still working and stuff like that. This is entirely based on manipulation of mist systems, mist cloud systems, which are still happening every day on the Big Island. So when you look at this, this is important, one, because it's the biggest environmental single impact. And it's just so visible when you see it. If you drive through this area, everywhere you look, you see these rows. I mean, you literally have rows of walls going all the way from here, going down for almost 20 miles. And then another system going for another 37 miles. Another system going for 14 miles. It's just mind-blowing. It's absolutely this huge, huge system of manipulation of a massive piece of the Hawaiian environment. And it was the success reason for the Big Island. Now, when Kamehameha ends up in charge, one of the things he does, he immediately makes sure that this isn't going to happen again. So he immediately starts to control the other chiefs, obviously, and basically shifts them in ways that are sort of intriguing. So let's do that next, because they sort of have to do this anyways. What he does, and of course what he had actually done the minute he's with the Europeans, is he's taking the animals, he's making a choice. First, the animals are more important than food. Secondly, he's taking the animals, he's processing those animals and then trading them for stuff. Now, what he's done that wasn't part of the traditional Hawaiian system, because this did include pigs, is he's commodified this. Now, what's commodify mean? I should point the tourism industry as a classic example because everything in tourism is commodified. So if I commodify, I'm trying to think of something easy to commodify. If I commodify being nice, what have I done? When will I be nice? I'll give you a hint. I'll only do it in one situation. When will I be nice to you guys? Think about it for a second. What's a commodity? And what's a commodity? When will I be nice to you guys? What do I want here?
Money.
Yeah,
Like
yeah. I want
raw
money.
material.
Yeah, exactly. What you've done is you've now made something have a cash value.
Yeah.
So if you think about it, if you're working in a restaurant, well, you can't be working in a restaurant now, but if restaurants pop back up and you're a waiter or waitress in a restaurant, if you say aloha to someone and you're nice to them, that's because you want a bigger tip. You've commodified the social relationship you have with the customer. And the reason that you've done that is not because you like that person, it's because there's going to be money coming into your hand if you do, and if you don't, you're going to get fired or you're going to not get a tip. Okay. So when you commodify something, you turn it into a value. So one of the huge issues in the Hawaiian community is the commodification of the word aloha. Because if you even look at the way it's used in the advertising industry and oftentimes the campaigns the state puts up, it'll be, you gotta be nice to tourists because they pay our bills. Well, that means that the only reason you're nice to tourists is because they're paying your bills. So you've taken something which was a social function and you now turned it into a cash function. So commodifying is where you start to put a cash value on something versus other reasons you do it. So, you know, going back to the original hypothesis, if I commodify being nice to you guys, the only time I'm going to be nice to you guys is if you tip me or pay me money. So I'll set up a Patreon page for this class. And if anyone wants a better grade, they can just, you know, they give me X amount of money and we can commodify what your grade should be. We can commodify how nice I'll be. We're going to commodify how much time I'll spend with you guys. And that would be a commodified landscape. That would be a commodified system. Okay. Now, the Hawaiian system was not a commodified system because there was no cash economy here. When the Europeans come in, that's the one thing they bring. Now, remember, this isn't the missionaries. We're still 40 years before the missionaries. But the Europeans in general, because you have to remember the folks that follow Cook aren't other explorers. They're traders. They're guys coming in who are going to, you know, are trading first in the Pacific Northwest, and they want to go send those to China and make lots of money. And they stop on Hawaii to get that meat and to repair the ships and then sail off there. And when they come back from China, they stop to get more meat and then sail back to New England or London or wherever. So those guys are only working. They're only in the Pacific because of commodities. They're only in Pacific because they want to make money and go back home and be wealthy. It'd be the same thing. For example, you go into education because you want to get paid well. You're not interested in teaching as an avocation or anything like that. You just like the paycheck. Well, on one hand, you might not be a particularly bad teacher, but on the other hand, I can pretty much bet you're not going to be a particularly good teacher because that's the only reason you're doing it. You're in a social engagement business, but you're only doing it because of the money attached to it. So commodifying things is an oftentimes very complex process because in the world we exist, a lot of the social interaction isn't supposed to be commodified, and people are oftentimes really uncomfortable when it does become commodified. If you think about it, trying to figure out what you should leave as a tip if someone gives you really shitty service. You know, on one hand, you're sort of like, well, you know, I suppose we're supposed to leave a tip because that's what you're supposed to do. But you think about, well, this person basically just crapped on our parade, you know, so why should we leave a tip? Well, if we don't da-da-da-da. And you know, you can find stories all the time in the newspapers or in the, you know, and online about, you know, so-and-so doesn't leave a tip and the waiter actually chases them outside the restaurant and says, why didn't you leave a tip when they were being an asshole? So the idea that you have taken something which is supposed to be social and you now placed a value on it and you have an expectation of that. And this is what tourism commodifies everything, because tourists are here based on the fact that they paid money. So they see the whole world that they go to as a commodified thing. So fun becomes something that you pay for. Getting has something exciting, is something you pay for. So everything becomes commodified. And if you work in the tourism industry, as many of you do, and I certainly did, is that everything that you do becomes commodified. Your behavior, how often you smile, everything becomes, what is it worth and what's the price of it? So this was the huge change in the Hawaiian landscape when the Europeans arrived, especially the traders in the late 1700s, early 1800s. They commodify everything. If the Hawaiians are going to interact with them and get the new things the Europeans have, they too buy into this. Now, the first folks that really jump on this idea of commodifying thing are, not ironically, the chiefs, because they already had this idea of mana as knowledge. So it's not a long hop from that to realize, well, if you have European stuff, in other words, European technology, whether it be a gun or whether it be an axe or whether it be a string of glass beads or whatever, those are all commodities, because that's, the Europeans aren't going to give them to you. They want something for them. And if you're a chief, you want those things because those things have mana, because they're different and they're not normal. So the chiefs moved from being warfare competitive, because Kamehameha made sure that didn't happen anymore. You tried to have a fight under his kingdom, you come down, send soldiers, and poof, and you're dead. So the chiefs, being highly competitive, shifted from killing each other to outspending each other or acquiring more stuff than each other. And of course, the Europeans encouraged this, because the more the chiefs would buy stuff, the more the Europeans had a market. So what happens is, by the early 19th century, the chiefs had become absorbed in commodification, and they did this as competition. So you buy stuff to have more than the guys you like the least. Okay. And of course, the top players in this were the Kamehameha family themselves, because they had to show that they deserved to run the system. So therefore, they had to have the most stuff, they had to spend the most money, and they had to have the most interesting or different types of things. So commodification occurs very, very quickly when the Europeans show up. Cook didn't bring it because he didn't pay for stuff. But the Europeans that show up after him, Portlock and all the names that you hear around Hawaii, all these guys are only here for the business of making money. So if they're going to trade with the Hawaiians, it's what's in it for me. And so they bring in this whole new value system of the what's in it for me and what's it going to cost, which hadn't existed before then. And a lot of the problems you see in the 19th century, especially during the monarchy, are because on one hand, people still talked about the system the way it had been. But the reality is the system had turned into this other type of thing, especially for the folks that were in charge of the system, and especially for the folks that ran the monarchy. They become the chief consumers. And if you're Maka'aina or a commoner, you're not a consumer in most cases right into the late 19th century. If you're living here in Hawaii and you're a Maka'aina, you're getting taxed up to the eyeballs so that the guys who run the system, the chiefs, can basically take the money that you worked for and spend that money and have a good old time buying crap that they need, their want, and you get almost nothing out of it. So the commodification here was massive. And a lot of what happens in the period from the 1800 on is a result of this becoming the main logic that people start using. And Kamehameha was, you have to remember that his focus was the world that he'd grown up in, which is a world of death, is a world of sort of Game of Thrones competition, and he was the winner. So he wanted to make sure that that didn't continue. He wanted to end the Game of Thrones. And so as far as he was concerned, whatever achieved that was the best possible solution. So that's why he's willing to destroy the whole, sort of economic system on the lee side of the Big Island. That's why he's willing to have the chiefs start to exploit the commoners for the purpose of acquiring stuff. In his view, those options were better than the alternative, which was, large-scale bloodshed through the Hawaiian Islands. And so it's important to remember that from where he was standing in, say, 1800, this all was a good idea. It wasn't a perfect idea, but it was a hell of a lot better than any of the alternatives, which, of course, one of the other alternatives is to just go to the British and say, okay, we'll be a colony, which he actually did. He actually told Vancouver if King George wanted, Kamehameha would be the high chief under the King of England. So basically Hawaii would turn into a colony like Tonga did. And the British just decided for whatever set of reasons not to pursue that. And then after a couple of years, then he decided that it wasn't a good idea. And at that point, okay, we'll just remain independent. So Kamehameha was operating off for several things. One is he intentionally commodified in large parts the system, because that gave people other things to pay attention to than I should be in charge. And the secondly is he was, by 1815, he, and especially when his wife takes over when he dies, Kaamanu, are definitely decided that being in a colonial system is a really bad idea, because by 1820, Kaamanu had heard enough stories about the Brits and the French and the Americans and everyone else about how bad they were when they took over a place, that Hawaii decided, the Hawaiian chiefs and the monarchy specifically decided there's no way in God's green earth they were going to become a colony. They were going to remain independent, come sort of hell or high water. And that other decision, that second decision, pretty much drives the choices that you then make from that point on. So it's always important to remember when people are looking in 2020 and saying, oh, the Mahele was a bad thing, for example, as we'll see, or this and that should never have happened. That's what the huge advantage of 100% hindsight. Like I think I mentioned before, a lot of the choices we're making right now in 2020, I can guarantee 20 or 50 years from now are going to look really stupid. And people are going to like, how the hell could you do something so stupid? Here, it's real obvious what's going to happen. And yet, from the standpoint of now, it seems like a viable alternative. In some cases, some people argue it's maybe the only choice that you do. So it's important to remember that when you're making choices at that point in time, it's not the same as looking back at the choices that were made in the past. They're two entirely different scenarios. So you've always got to cut some slack to the folks that are making choices, especially Kamehameha III in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, because what he saw as legitimate options turned out to have unexpected consequences, because of course you can't see into the future in the same way that whatever choices you guys are making in terms of why you're a shamanad, what your career is going to be and what you're going to do, you're making a set of choices based on what you think is going to happen. But Shota's not 35 years old looking back at his time at shamanad. He's still, we'll say 20 or whatever years of age he is now, and shamanad. So you don't have the luxury of being able to see into the future and choose the best option. You're choosing the best option on the limited knowledge you have available to you. So it's always important to remember that when you're looking at Hawaiian history and Hawaiian environmental decisions, they were made within a set of constraints that really shaped what people saw as the options that were available to them. So now one of the big ones with this, sorry, going back real quickly, it's important to remember that in all this, the missionaries haven't shown up yet. Very quickly, this is part of the 340 class, so I'm not going to get into in depth. Kamehameha dies 1819. His son Liholiho takes over. He's not a strong ruler. Unlike his dad, he didn't have a history of being a warrior. He was supposed to be head of the Ku religious order, but he didn't want to do it. He was of the highest possible rank in terms of the caste system. So he sort of saw himself as not having to follow any rules. And to be honest, in the Hawaiian system of the chiefs, that was true. So he must have been the impossible kid to bring up, because you couldn't tell him what to do. You couldn't punish him. He pretty much had the right to do whatever he wanted to do, or to not do anything he didn't feel like doing. So when he comes to power, he's pretty lame. He's not going to do a lot of stuff. So his Hanai'd mother, Kaumano, who was not his blood mother, but had Hanai'd him, and his real mother, Keopuolani, both Kamehameha's wives, take over the government. They leave him in charge, but it's sort of like Queen Elizabeth in England. She's sort of there, you do kissing babies, you do stuff like that, but you don't run the country. So the monarchy is run by these two women, both Kamehameha's wives, specifically Kaumano, who's the big player. And she's probably almost as sharp, if not sharper than her husband was. So the system she has is one where you've got your secular leaders, which includes her. And of course, you'd had the religious group. These are the kahunas or priests. Now, it's important to remember that Kamehameha was, of course, a Ku priest originally. He originally was the high priest, and his half-brother had actually been the ruler of that part of the island. The two of them didn't get along. And so after a couple of years, Kamehameha decided he's had enough. And rather than helping his brother, which is what he's supposed to do, he kills his brother and takes over the political head of the state. So he's not only the religious head, but he's also the political head. These were supposed to be two separate things. He ignores that, takes it over. So when he dies in 1819 and his son's pretty lame and hasn't done the religious thing, Kaumano's deathly afraid that some of these other families that have priests in them are going to go and do this to the Kamehamehas. So she decides, in a fairly logical move at the time, that the only way to short circuit this is to basically convince the population, especially the Maka'aina, that the priest view of the Hawaiian religion and Hawaiian religiosity was actually wrong. In other words, though she didn't intend it that way, what she's actually trying to do is prove the Pa'ao religion, as it is interpreted by the priest, was BS. And she does this very cleverly by staging a lunch with Liholiho and Keopuolani. So the three of them have lunch together. That was a huge, enormous kapu. Women could not eat with men, especially in the chiefs. And no one could eat with Liholiho because he basically was like a living god. So in having that lunch, they got the priest to basically go and freak out and basically go screaming, "Oh, you guys, the world's going to end. You're breaking all these kapus. The god Ku is going to come down and wipe this place off the earth." They have the lunch and nothing happens. And she'd set up a proclamation, so she gets Liholiho, which of course was always going to do what she wanted him to send out a proclamation to everyone in the Hawaiian Islands, in the monarchy, and basically say, at this point in time, it's been proven the priests lie. Their view of the religion is false, and therefore you no longer have to follow their kapus and you no longer have to listen to the priest. Now, what she had intended to do was cut the power of the priest off at the knees. What actually happened was entirely out of her cognizance. And what she managed to do, and this is sort of amazing because this is the only thing I know of in world history, have one person end a religion single-handedly. It's a spectacular thing because you have to remember religions are belief-based. People believe in their religion. And so it's incredibly durable and incredibly strong. But of course, because it's belief-based, if you can get people to be uncomfortable and think, well, maybe that's not true. Maybe my beliefs were wrong. Maybe people lied to me. Then all of a sudden that same religion is like it's built out of glass. And when you throw one rock into it, all things shatters, and that's the end of it. That's what happens. When she does that proclamation, the Maka'aina decide that the religion is false. And at that point, they go nuts. And this entirely place in 1820 turns into anarchy. There's a great account by Marin, who was one of the Spanish guy from Mexico who was tied into the monarchy, who was living in Honolulu at the time, about seeing a priest running down the street. And you don't know what type because priest wore tapa, but they're all sort of in the same outfits. You don't know whether it was a healing priest, whether it was one of the guys specializing in agricultural knowledge, or one of the coup priests. You don't know. But the commoners caught this guy in the street and literally rip him apart. So the commoners didn't make any distinction between priests that helped them, because you have to remember the priest held the body of knowledge of Hawaiian society. They were the ones that knew how to heal people. They were the ones that were in charge of management of land. When you, for example, open up the Hawaii so that you can run particular sections of property, where you place houses, all this type of stuff was purview of different groups of priests. But in saying that priests were false, she didn't specify one group of priests. She just said the priests were lying. And the Maka'aina interpretation of this is all of this was bullshit. And the whole thing goes wham. In the space of literally just weeks, the majority of Hale are torn down in the Hawaiian Islands. The key or images are destroyed. And any priest that's visibly a priest is pretty much killed on sight. So in literally just a couple of weeks, we go from a system of a very structured, very ritualized, very rigid religious social system to a system where the whole thing's just imploded, entirely due to her efforts. So she got what she wanted, but she got it like 8,000% more than she thought was going to happen. And so ironically, then the royal family has to go into hiding because this whole place is turning to anarchy, because it suddenly dawns on everyone, especially them, especially her, that the only reason the Maka'aina pay attention to the chiefs, to the Ari'i, is because the Ari'i were supposed to be special vessels of mana as specified by the priest. If you've just said the priests are full of crap and that logic is full of crap, then all of a sudden that means that there's no reason to listen to the chiefs. So basically she had unintentionally blew the monarchy apart because the monarchy was based on the traditional religion of Pa'ao, or the Arioi. Now the old religion of clans, family, and ancestors, that was still trucking along because the Maka'aina still believed in it. That wasn't declared false because it wasn't part of the political religious system. But all of a sudden the Heiau go out of operation, And that whole system just disappears. Now the monarchy is in absolute panic because all of a sudden their world has ended and they made it happen. It's not like anyone outside did it to them, they did it. And so they're in a panic trying to figure out what's going to do. And about 6 months into this dust up, all of a sudden a single ship sails in that originally had started in New England. So it comes around, I think, from Providence, New England, Rhode Island, or wherever it comes from. On it were a group of missionaries. Now, Hawaiians had been put on European vessels from the start. I think Vancouver, for example, took 5 Hawaiians with him when he left Hawaiian Islands. So all these whaling ships and trading ships that had come to Hawaii, all of them left with Hawaiians on board, usually as sailors, because they were great sailors, they were good workers, and they were heavily desired by your sailing ship captains. And so a fair number of these guys end up in New England, and one of them becomes really famous in sort of the talking circuit. I can't remember his name, it starts with O, and becomes really famous in New England talking about what life was like in Hawaii. And he goes into great length about how the Hawaiians are being reamed over by these, illegal and immoral traders and other guys like this. In other words, the Americans and the British that were selling them alcohol and selling them guns, and they were killing each other, and they were really just sort of bad people. So this group gets money together. The New England Missionary Society funds money to rent a ship, gets a bunch of their members to convince to become missionaries, and they pay to send them out to Hawaii to save the Hawaiians from the other Americans and the British and the other traders who are taking advantage of these poor, innocent, beautiful people. Now, at the same time, of course, they're also supposed to teach them to be Hawaiian, or I mean, to be Christian. So this group is sort of putting around. They show up 6 months into this mess that Kaumanu had made in Hawaii. Now, not surprisingly, she takes one look at them. Again, like her husband, she'd spent a fair amount of time studying other systems. And to her, it's a perfect opportunity. Here you've got a group of people who are talking about a religion. Now, she already knew about Christianity. She had 5 or 6 Brits and Americans who were already chiefs under her. So she knew all about Christianity. They just hadn't had missionaries, but they had people who, they had churches, or some little churches were already built by the time this all happened. So when the missionaries show up, she immediately goes, oh, wait a second. What I'm going to do is I'm going to PR these guys and say, hey, come on, help us out here. And what she's going to do is she's going to re-legitimize the monarchy, but with Calvinist Christianity to replace the religion she had just nuked less than a year before. So when the missionaries arrived, they're totally shocked, because when they had left New England, they were under the impression there were all these priests and all these heiaus and this real structured religious system that the monarchy was linked in hand to hand with. And when they get here, it's poof, it's all gone. So them, they see this sort of like God's blessing, because now there's this sort of open terrain to do Christianity or Christian work, and you're not fighting the old religion, because the old religion is imploded. And on top of that, the people running the state immediately say, hey, come on and let's work together. So Kaumanu, for example, becomes one of the first converts. Within 2 years of the missionary arrival, she tells everyone, especially the Makainana in Hawaii, you must become Christian. You must listen to the Christian missionaries. These Calvinist Christian missionaries are our new religion. So the missionaries never take over Hawaii. Most of the missionaries quit being missionaries within a couple of years and just become, businessmen. But the monarchy makes the Calvinist New England missionaries into the state religion here for very explicit purposes, the most obvious one being the survival of the monarchy. And that becomes really important, because if you don't understand that, then nothing that happens in the monarchy makes any sense. Because one of the classic stereotypes you get here that just drives people like me crazy, is the missionaries came in and screwed up Hawaii. No, the missionaries were only like 22, 24 folks. They couldn't screw up a population of a couple 100,000. The only reason the missionaries had any power at all is because the folks that ran the Hawaiian state declared them to be the new system. And so you had to listen to the missionaries, you had to obey the missionaries, not because people were necessarily interested in Christianity, but because you'd be punished by the government if you didn't. So the missionaries become powerful here because they become appropriated and sponsored by the government. And this relationship then, sort of in a weird way, sort of wanders through the whole monarchy period. Now, what you then is important to remember is, for Kaumanu's standpoint, that all makes sense. But from what she didn't understand, and I don't think the chiefs really did understand until maybe the 1860s, is the missionaries were top of this huge iceberg, which was the Euro-American colonial system of global economics. And the Hawaiians were a little tiny place with a relatively incredibly small population in one location. So though the Hawaiians thought they knew what was going on, all they saw was the tip of this iceberg. They didn't realize the huge power behind it. And the Europeans initially thought the Hawaiians were more powerful than they were. And once they realized the Hawaiians really didn't have any control outside of the Hawaiian Islands in proper, and the Kamehamehas didn't really have that much control over the population in the Hawaiian Islands, then all of a sudden the Europeans started to basically do in more and more sort of take over the system and turn their model of what they saw a European state should be like. Now, if you're Kamehameha III, so you're now in the 1830s, 1840s, you don't have a lot of choices. It's sort of like being on a roller coaster. You might not have wanted to get on the roller coaster, but once you're on the roller coaster and you're strapped down in that seat and the sucker's moving, you're on for the ride. You don't strap that thing to like jump off. So once Hawaii was part of the world order, once the Hawaiians were trading with the Europeans, once the Hawaiians had Christian missionaries in place, once they were a political state, then you had to do all the things that Europeans expected of political states. Otherwise, they would take you over and make you a colony. So the monarchy sort of finds itself in a situation where a lot of the choices that it makes, they didn't like. But the only other option was to start to fly the American flag or the British flag or the French flag, which they managed to avoid till 1899, which is amazing because no place else in the Pacific did. So for whatever failures there were of the monarchy, and there were a lot of them, it's important to remember that they managed to do something that none of their counterparts did, which was to keep Hawaii an independent nation for basically almost 100 years, with no one thinking that was a good idea but them. So in that concept, what happens is this commodification thing. Yeah, people knew it was a bad idea. People knew it wasn't. It was antithetical to a lot of Hawaiian values and stuff. But you don't have alternatives. In the same way that, you know, in the world that you live in, there might be a lot of things in what you do or that you are stuck with that you don't like and you would like to change. But you're one person in a population of almost 1 million people on this island. You know, so on one hand, yeah, a person can make change, but a person ain't going to make a whole hell of a lot of change. Unless you're Kawamoto, of course. So that's sort of the context for all this. So, and again, next time what I want to look at is the whole sort of commodification of the landscape, which is called the mahele. But I needed to give you this background to understand that when the monarchy does this, they understand a lot of the consequences, but they don't see themselves with choices. And to be honest, even in 2020, I don't see that they had any choice. So we'll get into that next time. So did that all sort of make sense? Relatively speaking. Everyone's looking at me blankly. Well, actually, most people aren't looking at me blankly because I don't have their cameras on, but okay. So we all good then on this? Okay. Okay, at that point, I guess we'll call this a